Hello and welcome to The Bottom Line here on TVP World, where we look into some of the main business and economic stories of the day. I'm your host, Marie Cato. On Wednesday night, news broke that the US was announcing a 15% tariff on the EU, which gave a sense that a final trade agreement might actually be on the cards. But the reality is that nothing is set in stone, and given the challenges of the extended US-EU back and forth, Europe is skeptical, keeping its options open. Jan Hagemejer brings us more in his report.
After months of tariff-driven uncertainty, European industries, from car factories in Germany to winemakers in France, may soon have a reason to pop the champagne. That's because the US and the EU are reportedly close to brokering a deal that would impose a 15% levy on the European Union's exports across the Atlantic.
We believe such an outcome is within reach, and we are working might and main to deliver that for EU citizens, for EU companies, for EU consumers.
As a result, European shares rose on Thursday, with the Stoxx 600 index reaching a 6-week high in the morning before slipping slightly in the afternoon. This would keep levies at current levels, a 10% baseline tariff plus a 4.8% average, according to the Financial Times. Still, it's a major improvement over Trump's 30% threat, which EU Trade Commissioner Maroš Šefčovič said would be dire in consequences.
Let's be honest, an idea of 30% tariff rate is effectively prohibitive to the mutual trade.
The United States is the European Union's biggest export market, buying over 530 billion euros in goods last year. In return, the EU imported 335 billion from the US, bringing total trade to nearly 870 billion euros. The reported agreement is also good news for Poland and other countries in the region, which may not be heavily reliant on direct exports to the United States, but are still deeply connected to the American economy when you look at the bigger picture.
If we take exports not only in goods, but in value added, we have a lot of indirect links with the United States via, for example, Germany and other EU member states, also via Canada and Mexico. So in all, United States are the second largest export or actually economic partner in the world for Poland.
The EU is, however, prepared for all scenarios, with a 93 billion euro reciprocal package covering 30% of US imports if the deal falls through. For months, the European Commission pushed for a 0-for-0 deal with the US, but after Japan agreed to the 15% tariff with the US on Tuesday, the EU also gave in to avoid a trade war. In a separate development in Beijing, the EU was trying to smooth trade relations with its biggest goods trader, China, but without concrete results.
We need concrete progress on issues related to trade and economy, and we both want our relationship to be balanced, reciprocal, and mutually beneficial.
Much like the situation with the United States, the growing goods trade deficit stands as a key point of contention between the EU and China, last year soaring to some 300 billion euros in China's favor.
So when it comes to the unpredictability of the current US president, there is still plenty of time until August 1st and everything can be reversed. But objectively, 15% down from 30% or 50% tariffs imposed on EU goods is a notable improvement. To tell us more, we are joined by Professor Jan Hagemejer, international trade expert at the University of Warsaw and president of the management board of CASE, a Polish think tank. Hello, and thank you for joining us.
Hello, thank you for the invitation.
So there is no framework set in stone. I think that's the main takeaway at the moment. But how certain can we say that we are looking at a final deal? Brussels says that a deal seems within reach. Do you think that the EU and the US are going to strike a deal shortly?
Well, I believe that since the message is out that they're very close to signing the deal, that probably means that we're very close to actually reaching it. But of course, I mean, anything can happen. We have seen that the US policy has been quite erratic over the last, let's say, year or so, and we're going to see what's going to happen quite soon, I hope.
So a 15% tariff rate, how is this going to impact trade between the US and the EU? We obviously heard Maroš Šefčovič say that a 30% rate would kill transatlantic trade. 15% is an improvement. What does that actually mean for trade between the US and EU?
So, to be completely honest, we don't know, because we don't know what is going to be the tariff schedule for everyone else, and that's very important, because the 30% tariff would be considerably higher than a lot of U.S. Trading Department were going to get in the reciprocal tariff story. But 15% is already quite low compared to that. I mean, the baseline tariff is 10%, but there are many large countries who are getting 25, 50, like China, for example, and so on. And this is all on top of the existing tariff. So it's not like we are replacing the existing tariff with these new tariffs, but adding those tariffs. So when the EU is on the lower side, that means that there's going to be quite a bit of substitution of exports over the longer term from the countries that were handed the higher tariffs to the EU, who was handed a lower tariff. So this is beneficial, although the whole exercise is quite bad for international trade in general and for world welfare.
Absolutely. And this rate obviously affects cars. And obviously the tariffs will be lower, like you said. But to put it into perspective, an EU car company sending a car to the US potentially faces an almost 30% tariff. And this has been something that has concerned European car producers very hard. Porsche, for example, has been struggling to adapt to this new reality. But if we're looking at a prospect of 15%, is this more manageable or is this a win? How would you interpret this?
For sure. However, we have to think about the fact that not all the EU, let's say, produced cars end up in the US from the EU, because there are factories of the European companies in different places in the world, including Mexico. So, of course, the tariffs on Mexico are also going to affect the investments of those companies that have been done over the long term in Mexico in order to export to the US. But when we think about, in general, the automotive sector in the EU, so of course the German sector is the most affected, because they have a lot of brands that are popular in the US. A lot of European companies, car companies, they don't export to the US because their cars they do not have any niche in the US market, while the Germans are quite popular, along with the Japanese and Korean. But then when we think about the other car companies, of course now car production is done in just a few huge amalgamates of different companies located around the world, including the European companies. For example, the French companies the French car companies are in a large capital group with several US ones. So there is a lot of trade in parts and components, which are essential both to the European cars produced in Europe, but also to the American cars produced in the US within those consortia.
And what about the 15% tariffs when it comes to Central and Eastern Europe? Because ever since we started hearing about the imposition of tariffs, all our experts that have come in have said, in regards to Central and Eastern Europe, it doesn't really concern us because we don't export that much to the US, so we shouldn't worry about it too much.
Well, I think the explanation by Marek Wąsiński that from Polish Economic Institute that we just heard, it's very good. There is a lot of indirect trade. So I told you some, very small bits and pieces about the parts and components, but in general, Polish goods exports are mostly parts and components, not only in cars, but in all the sectors except the food sector. So it's more than 60% of all the exports. So and this is for the Polish products, the only or almost the only way to reach outside of the EU, because most of our trade, the direct trade, and also majority of the indirect trade ends up in the EU, but because this is our first trading partner. But then most of the value added that is generated at home, in Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and so on, it ends up indirectly outside of the EU through, let's say, German exports and exports of other companies from the rest of the EU. So that's if I had to estimate the role of the whole Polish of the whole trade with the American economy with Poland, the whole exports of goods and services, direct and indirect, it would be around 2.5% of the Polish GDP.
So, in your opinion, you wouldn't say that is much to be worried about from our direct perspective.
Well, for Germany, it's 4%. So, so this is the size of the whole involvement we are talking about, because the industry where most of this value added comes from is a smaller part of the economy than the services and so on. But if you look at the industry and the manufacturing industry in particular, it's closer to 8%, 10%. For cars, for example, it's around 10% or so. So it's already a little bit higher. So if you think about the whole macroeconomic effect, let's say we lose 20%, 30% of that trade, well, it's not going to be particularly pleasant, but still it's not going to be a disaster, right? But if you were to cut it by 100%, then it's going to be much larger.
Absolutely. As the day progresses, we have no further confirmation coming out of Washington. It seems that Brussels is trying to get ahead of the game, and there is this 100 billion euro retaliatory package of US goods approved by member states, and there's also a separate list that is aimed to target US services, and this could kick in on August the 7th, a week later after August the 1st comes in, and we're supposed to allegedly have this deadline to strike this deal. Do you think that this is a strategic move, or is it actually unnecessarily fueling tensions between the EU and the US?
Well, I mean, in trade negotiations, when you cannot, get to an agreement using, let's say, peaceful terms, you have to coerce, and this is some sort of coercion. I mean, you threaten. I mean, you have one threat, and then you respond with another threat, right? And then the analytical department of the European, American, U.S. Trade Commission, they computers, their models, and they calculate. This is like a tit for tat sort of a game, and they see whether it is still basically worth it to do that, to go on with the original tariff. But it has to be said that in general, this whatever tariff is imposed on the EU and all the other countries, the country that is going to lose the most is the EU, is the US.
Understood. I just wanted to go back to the Central and Eastern European countries and the manufacturing parts that you mentioned, because the CE is directly and indirectly very closely bound to Germany and France. And I just wanted to bring up what Marek Waśniewski had to say. So let's just take a look at that.
If we take exports not only in goods, but in value added, we have a lot of indirect links with the United States via, for example, Germany and other EU member states, also via Canada and Mexico. So in all, United States are the second largest export or actually economic partner in the world for Poland.
So do you feel that our expert here, Waśniewski, believes that the significance is greater?
I don't think we're in a disagreement here. The US is the second largest economic partner after the EU of Poland. But the EU has several times larger significance than the US.
Okay.
So I mean, there is a lot of asymmetry. If we consider our international trade, a great majority of that trade is only with the EU, even in indirect trade. But the second partner after that is the US.
Is the US.
Yeah.
The EU is pretty specific about how it wants to implement its retaliatory measures upon the US if it indeed comes to that, and it plans to target certain products like Boeing aircraft, Levi jeans, chicken and soybeans, and also a levy would be added to EU scrap metal, which the US uses for fresh steel products. How would this translate into practical impact upon the US?
Well, an escalation of the trade war is going to be, again, detrimental both to the US and the EU. The more we go into increasing tariffs on both sides, the worse it is. The idea is that at some point we realize that it's not worth it anymore and we get to an agreement. The point is to get to an agreement before we start escalating.
Do you think that it will actually come to this? What do you think the chances are? Because there's also this angle where the EU could potentially commit to investing in the US, which is something that happened in the Japan-US deal. Do you think that this would actually be an incentive for the US?
Yeah, to some extent it is. I mean, the foreign direct investment, in particular in areas where manufacturing of cars and car-related activities in the states that are disadvantaged by globalization, essentially could be an advantage for the US, and the US could sort of consider that as a viable strategy to make the tariff escalation milder. But of course, the problem is that this is a lot of, in fact, this sort of strategy it's called, in fact, import substituting FDI or export substituting FDI, where when you install your own factories close to the market when you are selling, well, it's from the point of view of efficiency, it's not great because you already have your factories, and as long as transport costs are not very high, duplicating them is not necessarily good for efficiency because of economies of scale. So probably the most efficient way would be just to export those cars from Europe or from whenever they are produced to the US than to invest in extra companies. This is like in extra factories in the US. This is like a second best solution in a way when you cannot get to agreement about the tariff levels and so on and the protection. Now, of course, the whole point is that you want to employ American. I mean, the point of the Trump administration in that case would be that it's going to be employing. It's going to be leading to an employment of American citizens that are unemployed. But the problem, of course, is when you look at the U.S. labor market is that there is not so much of a buffer of labor there to be employed. In particular, that at the same time they're cutting down on immigration. So all in all, once again, building or rebuilding the car industry in the U.S., it's not an easy job. In particular, that you have limited resources within the country, and your country already started specializing in something else, which is services mostly.
Sure.
Yeah.
So essentially, we hope that this 15% tariff deal will come to fruition, and essentially it won't be detrimental to our region.
Of course.
Okay.
Of course, we have to do that. I mean, it's always better. 15 is always better than 30, and 15 is going to be less detrimental to our economies than 30%. But of course, once again, the first best solution would be to just back off and then try to get to a place where we go back to the initial tariffs, which were there and have been negotiated over several years. So the sudden change in the whole approach to the international trade, for sure, is not going to bring anyone anything good.
Absolutely. Okay, Professor Jan Hagemejer, international trade expert at the University of Warsaw and president of the board at CASE. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And that concludes The Bottom Line for today. I was your host, Marie Cato. We bring you the best of regional business Monday to Friday at 5:10 CET on TVP World. And in the meantime, for the latest in regional business, follow us on X and on tvpworld.com. Goodbye.